I found out
Look at that.
later on just how devastating
Children
it was.
decided it was time for mother and father.
I appreciate the invitation to come here today because this place on Peaks Island is really a national treasure. I hope everybody can see okay because it is so unusual. And that's what the building looked like 130 years ago. So that was brand new. That was a brand new building on Peaks Island. And it was built by a very interesting group of folks who in April 1861, from the greater Portland area, including Gorham, by the way, volunteered to save the Union. So President Lincoln is saying, Fort Sumter's been fired on. These states in the Union are saying they're going to secede. I'm not going to allow that. I need 75,000 volunteers to save the Union. And they thought a show of force would bring the southern states back. So 1,000 men from the Portland area signed up and later became what was called the 5th Maine Volunteer Infantry when it was incorporated into the Army of the Potomac, which was the Union Army protecting Washington. They signed up for 90 days. Well, it didn't go as Lincoln had planned. First of all, he didn't stop at 75,000. It grew to over 1 million and then 2 million and then more. And the 90 days after the first Battle of Bull Run turned into 3 years. So these men who were farmers, lawyers, fishermen, loggers, they weren't soldiers at all. They were not soldiers. These men stayed in the fight for 3 years. So they were involved in all the major battles in Maryland, Virginia, and Pennsylvania for 3 years. So if you talk about the area from Petersburg, south of Richmond, all the way to Gettysburg, they were involved in that whole area, which was really an amazing thing. And they did it to save the Union. And it's really a remarkable story. Out of those 1,000, probably a third didn't survive the experience. We think about 2/3 did, but it's hard to count because some left without permission, some were lost somewhere and never seen again, others ended up in prison, in Confederate prisons, and some went to other units. So it's hard to keep track of exactly what happened to everybody who was signed up. They were mustered out in Cold Harbor, Virginia in July 1864. Union Army said, we no longer need the 5th Maine Regiment, so you guys can go home. And out of that original 1,000, there were only 264 still in the 5th Maine Regiment that were still original members of the regiment. And I love the story about going home because the Union Army at that time didn't provide much in the way of support. It was getting better, but it was a little roughshod at times. So they said, well, you can go back to Maine, but didn't provide them any way to get there. And it's a long walk from, Richmond area back to Maine. And so I love the story. They went and they found some train sitting on a track. And they went up to the engineer and said, can you take us to Maine? And he did. And that's how they got back to Maine. Isn't that interesting? I find it a fascinating story. And I'm a veteran, so I spent 33 years in the Air Force, a lot of that time overseas, from Vietnam all the way up to the Balkans and northern Iraq as well. And so I have a special affinity for this place. And then I worked after I came here to Portland, living on Peaks Island, I went to work after a few different jobs trying to find a new career. I worked for Martins Point Healthcare for 15 years. And I worked with their military program. So I did the marketing and sales for the military program they have. They have a program, a government contract that they've had since 1981 to take care of military families. So my job was to go out and convince military families, sign up for Martins Point and we'll take good care of you. They do. They really do a great job. So it was a great job. I finally retired. So now I have time to come to places like this and talk about the 5th Maine Regiment, which is wonderful. So I'm really glad Lisa was interested in hearing about it. But the regiment, and I will get to the briefing at some point, but there's so much background I want to tell you. The regiment, when the war is over, so they're back home with their families now, and they decided in the 1870s, let's go to Peaks Island for an annual reunion. Well, Peaks Island by that time had become a resort. So there were big hotels on the island. You could go to the island, you could get a hotel room, you could rent a cottage, you could put up a tent for that matter. And so they started having reunions on Peaks Island. And a woman whose husband was a lieutenant in the regiment sold them the land, and they decided to build a building. And this is what they built. They built it by raising money from the members of the regiment. And if you go inside the building, and I hope some of you get a chance to visit it sometime, there are these glass windows in the building. They all have etched names in them. And it was like buying a brick today. You bought a pane of glass. So if your name were Hall, you got Hall on a piece of glass, and it got put in the window. And it's all colored glass. So if you go into the building, this whole memorial hall, big hall, is all lighted up with colored glass with all these names on it, which is really kind of neat. So they raised the money, bought the materials, hired an architect, and put up this building. And that's what it looked like in 1888 when they opened it up. And then the reunions from that point on were held in this building. Originally, there were bedrooms in the building. There were 14 bedrooms in the upper floor. The tower, the top was opened up, so you could actually go out there and look around. And they continued the reunions until 1940. 1940, the last, and these were descendants at this time, the last regimental actual soldier died in 1937. So by this time, you've got the descendants having the reunions on Peaks Island. And then the descendants decided in the mid-1950s, we can't keep this building going any longer. They gave it to a community association. So we maintain it today as a museum for the 5th Maine Regiment, and we also maintain it as a Peaks Island History Museum as well. Hopefully I'm going the correct way on these slides. So that's the reunion in 1912. I love this picture. So here they are, they're there with their families. These are the veterans of the regiment out here in the front. And again, they held the reunion every year. And there was a caretaker in the building who lived in the building year round, took good care of the building. And again, if you wanted a bedroom, you could rent a bedroom from $3 to $9, depending on the quality of the bedroom. If you were in the tower, you believe they had a bedroom in the tower, the very top of the tower, $9 a week. It must have been like being at camp, right? Because it's all open. And I think it was open for another 20, 30 years. It's not open anymore. But here's one of their reunions, and I love the dress too. It's amazing how standards of dress have changed. So there's the building today. And I don't know when it turned from brown to yellow, but it turned to yellow at some point. So we maintain it today, and it's really in constant use. And I'm the recruiter for all, it's open as a museum during the summer, so I recruit all the docents. We have about 30 folks who are volunteer docents. They're guides inside the museum. So when people come visit, they can find out what is this place about. We have about, depending on the year, we go up, we had last year 5,400 people coming to the museum. Isn't that amazing? And the Peaks Island is still a very favorite place for people to go visit, just to walk around or bike around or whatever. And so they'll come into the museum sometimes just out of curiosity. So we have and then we have a lot of lectures there, we have music performances there, and a lot of the island nonprofits use the building for their meetings as well. So that's what it looks like today, and I hope you can get a chance to visit. It's a 10-minute walk from the ferry if you're interested. Ferry is very easy, 20-minute ride. It's all 20 minutes across the bay. We're only 3 miles out on the bay. So there is George Bicknell. Now, who's George Bicknell? This is the reason I'm doing this lecture. He was a lieutenant. He was inducted as a private. And when the 5th Maine Volunteer Infantry was created, he was brought in as a private. He was a smart man, and he rose through the ranks rapidly, as things do happen in war, and became a lieutenant as the adjutant. Adjutant means the administrative officer for the unit. So took care of things like a lot of supplies. He took care of payroll, the rosters, things like that. But he was in the fight for all 3 years with the 5th Maine. And then finally in 1871, he wrote a fantastic history of the regiment. So it's a book about that thick, and it's a really interesting read, History of the 5th Maine Regiment by George Bicknell. Then later in life, as a picture here, he decided to go on the lecture circuit. The lecture circuit was a boom in the late 19th century. So you don't have movies yet. What do people do? They go on the lecture circuit. And you put on lecture. Mark Twain, if anybody saw a really interesting program on Mark Twain not very long ago, Mark Twain was in debt like $200,000. How did he get his $200,000 to pay his debtors? He went on the lecture circuit, and he was a fantastic lecturer. George Bicknell did the same thing, and he wrote a lecture called Down in Dixie, a veteran story of the Civil War in 135 views. So what does that mean? He actually created slides. And I honestly didn't know you could do this, but the technology was there. So he went to Boston and he said, paint me a scene of a battle. And he would describe the scene. Artists would paint the scene on this glass slide. And once the painting was complete, you'd put another slide on top. Then you tape the edges and you have a slide. And then, I didn't realize this could be done. Well, but some of the slides are photographs too, and you'll see that. Some of them are they're not all paintings, some are photographs. Then he puts the slides together with the text and drops the slides into a machine called a stereopticon. The stereopticon is not stereo in the way we think of stereo with depth, right? It's actually a machine with two racks of slides. And when you throw a lever, the next slide comes up. And you just keep doing that, and you run through these two racks of slides in the correct sequence. So he put on a slideshow. And the slideshow went all over New England, and I think into the Midwest as well. And it was very, very popular. And this is his bill from one of his slideshows. And there are a lot of different lectures in there. Title of the lectures, Across the Rockies. This is before movies. And the lecture circuit was huge. And we have a drawing in the 5th Maine showing one of his lectures. There's this big audience in a big theater and a screen. Remember the screen, when you're talking about, remember the screen here, right? The screen and a stereopticon, and he's projecting slides up. And this is 1890. Isn't that amazing? I didn't know you could do that. And he's talking and he's flipping through slides. So my wife my poor wife, she gets dragged into all this stuff that I love. But anyway, we've got this written script, right? A handwritten script of his lecture. My wife takes that whole script and transcribes it into Word. So now it's in the digital world, right? And then she takes all of his slides and scans them. So now we have a digital copy of the slides as well. And that's what I'm going to go through today. So I'll read some of the script. I won't give you the whole lecture because it goes for an hour and a half. Might be a little long. But I've taken excerpts out of it. And I've got the slides that George Bicknell had prepared. And so now I have for you a 19th century PowerPoint. So everything's been converted. It's all digital now. So, but anyway, that's George. And I'll start, what I'll do is I'll just read through some of the parts of the lecture, and I'll try to keep my slides in sequence. I'm not terribly good at that. And you may notice some things. Bill, would you change that slide, please? So feel free to tell me. But the slides are, again, they're digitized now, but some of them are a little hard to, we don't have all the slides. So 135 views, we couldn't find all the views. We've got probably about 70 or 80 of them. The rest, I'm not sure how they disappeared over time, but they did. So we don't have all the slides that we'd like to have, but I have quite a few of them. And I'll show you, again, how this thing was done. So George, let's get started. And first of all, please be kind to your fellow. This was one of the slides. So yeah, please show respect for the fellow listeners.
Can you see it? It says, will the ladies kindly remove their hats and bonnets?
Right.
That those behind the wearers may be happier.
Yes, that was, yeah.
Now, how about
So that was put up to make sure people could all see this presentation. So now we're going to get started. And this is George Bicknell's own writing. So his own lecture that, again, he delivered to probably thousands of people. So we're 1861. To arms was the bugle note heard in 1861, echoing from one end of the nation to the other. An experience always to be remembered pertaining to our country was that of the Civil War. From whence its beginning, and I think this is very interesting if you look at American history, and I grew up in Virginia, and all of my relatives were Southerners, and all of my ancient relatives were Confederates. So I've had to relearn a lot of history. And I married a girl from Boston. Can you imagine the cultural clash right away? First, I couldn't understand her. She spoke some very, very strange New England dialect that I couldn't quite grasp. But we've gotten along fairly well for the last 57 years, so it's been okay. But it's really amazing because there was a huge reinterpretation of, and I remember this from being in the South, and I spent a lot of time in Georgia with my mother's relatives, but the Civil War was reinterpreted. It was reinterpreted in a way that the slavery, the issue of slavery, disappeared from the story. The story became one of, if you're in the South, you hear the story of the Northern aggression, North imposing its way of life on the South, and you hear the story of the lost cause, and then you hear all, you go, every Southern town. I grew up in Alexandria, Virginia, and right in the center of our town was a statue of a Confederate soldier. And so it's a very different story that you hear. But George Bicknell, writing in 1880, says, "From whence its beginning?" And his answer is the Negro and cotton. And I think that's a very interesting interpretation because, again, to me, the issue, if you really study the war, was the issue of slavery and the continual pressure from the South to expand slavery into the new territories that we had. A single sentence may not comprehend all, and yet it expresses in a degree the causes of the war. For unquestionably the center around which they revolved was the Negro and his relation to the cultivation of cotton. Influenced by the spirit of patriotism that filled the hearts of so many men in those days, your speaker left home and family on the morning of June 24, 1861, and presented himself as a recruit at the camp of the 5th Maine Regiment of Maine Volunteer Infantry, which was quartered just outside the city limits of Portland, Maine. The preliminaries upon my entering military service were very brief. "How tall are you?" was asked. 6 feet 3 inches. George Bicknell was a very tall man for that time. "Your age?" 23 years. "Your weight?" 151 pounds. 6 feet 3, 150 pounds. Wow. "All right," was the word. "Go ahead." And the examination was ended. Since then, I have gained nearly 100 pounds. In a few moments, the new recruit, with several others, was paraded before a captain of the regular army, who was so intoxicated that he could only stand with much difficulty, but who managed to call our names. And as each responded, he was thereby mustered in the Army of the United States and entitled at that time to $11 per month and found. Found meant board and clothes, which were soon found to mean the poorest kind possible. For 9 months, a single shirt was each man's allowance. When a change was needed, a soldier took it off, washed it as best he could, and when it was dry, put it on again, his coat in the meantime covering his body. The men were jubilant. Now this is really, I think this opening is very interesting compared to what happened later. The men were jubilant over the order to the front, much more so than in the few months afterward. Spoiling for a fight became changed to, when will this cruel war be over? How many times have we gone through that lesson? Several waited until the last moment to say goodbye to the loved ones being called as the regiment passed. This is one of the slides that, somebody in Boston as an artist prepared for this presentation, which I think is very interesting. Then the men were in heavy marching order, which meant carrying all we possessed on our persons, containing a load weighing about 48 pounds. This included gun, knapsack, blanket, cooking utensils, overcoat, canteen, and haversack with several days' rations. By the way, at the 5th Maine Regiment Museum, we have hardtack. So we actually have some hardtack there that was brought by some of the veterans and put into cases around the walls of the museum. Did you ever consider the personnel of the Army? It was composed principally of young men between the ages of 18 and 26. Of course, there were thousands of men much older. They were called from all ranks and conditions of life: lawyers, students, clerks, farmers, mechanics, and so on. Generally speaking, the officers were young, and this is a photograph, so tinted photograph. The three upon the right of this picture were the officers of Company H, your speaker's company. So you have a regiment. At the start of the Civil War, they had regiments that were about 1,000, and a company would be about 200, making up, so many companies making up a regiment. A regiment in turn would belong to a corps, so that was the structure. Then the corps would belong, in this case, to the Army of the Potomac. primary mission of the Army of the Potomac was to protect the Capitol. That was the primary mission. So these are officers of Company H a few weeks after the Battle of Bull Run on July 21, 1861. Lieutenant Shannon, Captain Brown, and your speaker. And I've always wondered, he cites 3, and I'm trying to figure out there are 4 in the picture. So anyway, a mystery. Less than 1 month later. So this is on the 20th of July, and our camp was in Centerville, Virginia, a very insignificant place, but made quite famous afterwards. Now, the actual encampment of the 5th Maine, so they left Portland and they traveled by ship down to New York. They got put on a train and they went to Baltimore. But they had to disembark, come off the train in Baltimore, and then they had to go around Baltimore at nighttime. And the reason for that was Baltimore was very pro-Southern. So it was dangerous actually to march through Baltimore. So they had to kind of skirt Baltimore, came into Washington and by boat, and then ended up in Alexandria, Virginia, my hometown, which was where their encampment was. Turn out, face in rapidly, men. It was 1 o'clock Sunday morning when we heard, this is the first time they're going to be in combat, this most unwelcome order. What a miserable preparation we had for actual service. Why, the brightest recruit cannot be made a soldier, really fit for service inside of months. Our men had been instructed in their duties for only a few weeks, and some of them for only a few days. Our drill was very poor. The officers, as well as the men, were green. This is just a roadside picture from Virginia. This is as they're being told to march to the direction of the battle. As the sun rose, it threw its hot rays on us. So we're talking about July in Virginia, which is pretty hot. Soon the atmosphere was in the 90s. We were clad in thick wool garments, fit only for winter wear. And this is July. The government had nothing better with which to furnish us. After about 10 hours waiting, we never knew for what, the order came to march, and which was soon followed by the command double quick, the best possible way by which to thin our ranks and exhaust our men. We were whipped by marching and running long before we reached the battlefield. On and on we ran, leaving the woods, and we were hurried across an open plain where we had our first experience of being under fire. A Confederate battery was not a mile away. We saw a puff of smoke whiz, and a solid shot tore a man in pieces who was only a few feet in front of our regiment. In a few moments, it seemed hours, we passed into a ravine where we were partially shielded from the enemy's fire, although very near his lines. Here we were met by wounded soldiers, Negroes, civilians, all crying, "Go in, boys, the day is ours, the Johnnies are running." We had just faced front when a body of cavalry came dashing out from the woods beyond. "It is the Black Horse," was the cry. The Black Horse was the celebrated and much feared cavalry of the Confederates. They seemed to be dashing upon us in our cannon. To add conviction to the cry, a small shower of bullets whistled through the air, and the next moment, a stupendous panic, pardon me while I switch pages, struck our brigade. Officers as well as men cleared many a feet at a single bound toward the rear, as if they could out-travel the horses. But the mistake was soon discovered. It was our own cavalry, with "What are you afraid of?" on the faces of the rallied soldiers, and the positive assurances of the officers that they were endeavoring to check the retreat. The line was reformed. Up the hill to the summit, pandemonium reigned. Zip, zip, whiz came shot, shell, and bullets. Not a few, but tens of thousands. "Fire, boys, fire," came the word, but at what? At about 300 yards was a belt of woods. From these woods came the balls, but there was not a single Johnny in sight. Johnny was the nickname given to the Confederates. In like manner, the Union men were called Yankees. Then those guns of ours were the old-fashioned smooth-bore Springfield muskets, so they weren't really rifles, weighing anywhere from 10 to 12 pounds. We have a couple of these in the museum, and they're pretty heavy, and they're also very long. They are very seldom seen in these days. It was difficult to tell at which end there was the greatest danger. The gun kicked so, worse than a mule, and it was not straight. The safer place was a few feet away in front of the gun. I have my gun, the one I carried for 3 months. How did I obtain it? Upon my promotion to a lieutenancy in Company H in September, I purchased it as a keepsake. But I never look at it that I do not fully realize that I paid the government $13 of hard-earned money for a 10-cent gun. But we fired as fast as we could, all at the woods. I do not believe my company killed anyone in that fight. I don't know, but I'm positive that my conscience is very clear every time I look at my gun. I know that I came quite close to being nearly almost killed myself with the old thing. What's that? An order. Cease firing. Retreat. March. Confusion at once. Did we march? Not much. It was a go-as-you-please style. Oh, the horror of a retreat. Overwhelming fear with thousands and despair in the hearts of the commanders, for they realize the stigma which may rest upon them. Roads blocked by broken wagons or artillery carriages, horses, men, wounded, dying by the roadside, troops fleeing in every direction, the flushed, eager enemy behind, hurling hot shot and shell after the fugitives, or cavalry cutting into the right, cutting to the left. If there is a worse condition on earth, I have never seen it. No one can possibly describe that retreat. General McDowell, the Army commander, was powerless. So this is their first encounter with fighting. And this is after very, very little training in, how to fight and how to do formations, how to protect themselves, and so forth. And they've basically been run into a battle in the middle of the summer in Virginia. They meet the Confederates, and Bull Run, as you know, that first experience for the Union Army was a complete disaster. The retreat was chaotic. Oh, how tired these men were. Knapsacks, coats, blankets lined the road for miles. Even guns by the scores were thrown away. A brief halt at midnight when the stern command, on to Alexandria, the starting point of several days ago. No matter if it were our second night up and we were almost exhausted, the enemy was close behind. We must march lively or go to a southern prison. So they were afraid of a couple of things. One is they were afraid that they were going to be attacked again by the Southerners. And the other thing was they would be captured and sent to this prison here, which is Libby Prison in Richmond. We preferred to march, and so literally dragged ourselves over the long, long road, reaching Alexandria, a city about 6 miles from Washington, at noon and wondering what would happen next. And there was very much of an expectation that the Confederates were going to come and attack the capital. Now, please note our experiences briefly summed up, and remember we were green troops. Nearly 40 hours without sleep, a march of over 44 miles, engaged in the heat of battle, and the result a failure. None of the privates could resign. Didn't we wish we could? But there were many officers who suddenly disappeared with pressing business at home. And they went. We had gone, now this is a picture of Bull Run actually, we had gone to Bull Run with all sorts of patriotic songs on our lips, expecting to have Senator Fessenden, Senator Fessenden was one of Maine's 2 senators at the time, prophecy realized that the war would not continue 90 days and that we should have a very pleasant excursion down south at government expense. We were now forced to spend 8 long months in preparation for future duties, during which time active hostilities were suspended. So the Southerners never did follow up on that victory. I think they were expecting that there would be some accommodation, some kind of an arrangement for talks with the North, with Lincoln, to say, okay, how could we allow this secession to go ahead? But that didn't happen either. Camp life, though in many ways unimportant, became monotonous and irksome. Mounting guard, cleaning streets and equipment, and company drill, 2 or 3 hours were morning duties, while battalion drill, always hard-dress parade, and incidental were afternoon recreations. Picket duty, day and night guard duty came at shorter intervals. An occasional foot or horse race enlivened the hours. Church attendance. This is important after our discussion about the flags in church. This is important. Church attendance. Every Sunday morning was compulsory, exceptions being made in favor of those who had been on guard duty the night before or it had a surgeon's certificate of disability. Sudden sickness or a seventh-day headache didn't work. As soon as the service commenced, a patrol visited each street and tent and arrested all who would stay at home. This is their chaplain, Chaplain Adams. Generally speaking, the men sat on grass before the preacher, who was quite sure of a good congregation, much more so than is the preacher of today. Now, that's just a map. That is, I don't know how that, I don't think it projected any better in 1890 either. But you have probably heard of Chickahominy Swamp. This is a little bit later now. So what had happened is they had that Battle of Bull Run. And then in 1862, the Union Army decided, well, they're going to come at the south. They're not going to go directly down to Richmond, right? They're going to come from around. They're going to come in from the east. So they're going to go down to the Rappahannock area, Yorktown area, and they're going to come into Richmond that way, in that direction. You've probably heard of the Chickahominy Swamp near Richmond, where we remained so long. The swamp was several miles in length and quite wide. It was an awful place. No account of it can begin to touch the truth. I show you one view just before engineers and troops made it passable. Malaria and disease were at every hand. The water was almost nauseating. So again, you've got this, we're coming in from the east side, the marshy side of Virginia, really, and it's again summertime. The food was simply outrageous. I'm not exaggerating. Upon facts, I shall not exaggerate this evening. The food should have been and might have been better. It wasn't the fault of the government, but of the Army contractors. This is a familiar complaint. Army contractors and their friends who had a certain pull with the government and who became rich from the soldiers' necessities and saved their bodies from the rebel bullets. It will take a great deal to save their souls. This is I thought this was an interesting image. So this is a sutler, and I'll run one picture up here. That's hardtack. So that's an actual piece that we have that's our photograph of the hardtack we have at the 5th Maine. There was hardtack from the wars of a past generation that remained unconsumed until about 63. It was rumored that the same, that is the hardtack, which defied mastication, was marked 76, which would be 1776. I'm not sure if that's completely true, but he did have a little exaggeration. Yeah, and it is really hard. I mean, it's flour that's been flour and water, and it's just allowed to harden, and it literally does not decay. I mean, you could use it to build houses. I mean, it's that hard. I mean, yeah, flour and water, yeah, and just allowed to harden. Yeah, so. What's that?
That's how you make paste.
Yeah, exactly. It's paste, right? Exactly. Yeah, and so if you want to eat it, typically they would try to find some way to moisten it a little bit. I don't know how else you could do it. Officers and men who had some surplus money did not fare much better, as prices were so high few could purchase. True, there was a sutler's store. So this is a sutler's store. The sutlers were private, profit-seeking individuals who traveled with the army with supplies. And so if you wanted to go to the sutler's store, you could go there and purchase things that you couldn't get from the army. True, there was a sutler's store, but when one had to pay 50 cents a dozen for common crackers, and that's a lot of money in those days, or $1.50 for a pound of butter, and other articles in like proportion, he could not live like a king while on $13 a month. To which magnificent sum the soldier's pay had been raised, because it started at $11 a month, some time ago, or become a millionaire upon the average officer's salary. It is unquestionably true that poor food and sickness killed more men in the Chickahominy Swamp than Confederate bullets. So again, 1862. And by this time, there was a sanitary commission from the Union Army, which was designed to, if you have this big encampment, you have to have sanitary conditions in the encampment, but the Army the American Army had never been this big before. It never really had the understanding of how you do that. So a lot of women from Maine went down to Alexandria, and they helped organize sanitation for the camp. So not only did you have nurses who were, working for the Army during that time, but you also had women going down there and working on the issues of sanitation and how you have a camp that doesn't literally kill everybody with disease, which was a real challenge. And there's really some interesting stories about the conflict between the Maine women, who thought they should run things, and the U.S. Sanitary Commission, which thought it should run things. And the Maine women said, nope, we'll take care of our boys. Go away. And it's very interesting. There's an interesting story that goes with all that. I'll show you just one, let's see, where am I? I've lost, okay. So we're gonna roll up a little bit here, past the hardtack, and I'm gonna take you one more year up, and again, we've left out chunks of the presentation just to make it a little bit shorter. But so now, 1862, the Peninsula Campaign occurred in Virginia, and now we're in 1863. General Hooker, the new commander, fell upon the enemy at Chancellorsville, not far away, with results that were both disastrous to himself and the army. It was during this engagement that your speaker was severely wounded by a ball passing over the top of his head, taking in its track a piece of the skull about its size, and making quite a furrow and leaving the brain almost bare, compelling him to be taken to the rear. So that's one of our photographs. Now that's George's hat. So that's George Bicknell's hat. And this was in 1863, and he was out riding, and a Confederate took a dislike to him and put a shot at him, and it went through the top and took off a piece of his scalp. And then he says what happened. Reaching the hospital quarters a mile away, the surgeon bound up that's George's head, and directed him to lie down in a shelter tent nearby. He did so, and although the remark the surgeon made to the chaplain, who stood by, and was overheard by this officer, "Poor fellow, he will probably bleed to death in an hour," was not inspiring as some other remark might have been, yet he went to sleep, and notwithstanding the terrible roars of artillery and musketry, he slept for nearly 6 hours. When he awoke, his mind was clear as ever, but he was a bloody spectacle, and was ordered to the hospital tent. He little realized then that he had received a blow from which he would suffer for years. Before being struck, he had a piece of his saddle shot away, third button of his coat cut away, and was still unharmed, had still been unharmed, and this is the first time he really was seriously injured. Your speaker was shortly afterwards, during my absence, that the Battle of Gettysburg was fought, so this is 1863, in which my regiment participated. As this battle has been so minutely described in books and papers and lectures, I am compelled to bypass it. I can truly say that I've always regretted, this is an interesting regret, being absent from the battle of this war, because he was home in Maine recovering from his wound, but I returned for some very severe engagements afterwards. Exchanges of tobacco for coffee, as you have probably heard or read about, were sometimes carried out between the lines. I saw several such instances. "Hello," would cry a Reb. "Hello yourself," would be the Yank's response. "Got any coffee?" "Yes, Johnny. Have you any tobacco?" "Yes." "All right, let's swap." "Well, lay down your gun," would cry each, "and we'll meet halfway." Perhaps in an hour or less would be past social intercourse, when a command or signal would be given to return. "Well, goodbye, Yank." "Goodbye, Johnny." "Now look out, Yank, for when I get back, I'm going to shoot." "All right, Johnny," would be the response, "and I'll shoot too." At the next moment, maybe, in their respective lines, shielded by some little impromptu breastwork, they would be watching to shoot each other down as they would shoot a dog. Truly, war was, war is, and war ever will be awful. There never was a time, as we gathered around the campfire, that we did not think so. So we're going to launch into the spring of 1864 now. It was spring again. After 2 years and nearly 9 months in service, in March 1864, your speaker was compelled, through sickness and injuries, to tender his resignation. There was but one thing for him to do, and that was return home. His old regiment continued its historic work on the front for 3 months longer. What a tremendous sacrifice it made during its 3 years. As I have said, it left Maine in 1861 with 1,000 men. During the 3 years, it received a very large number of recruits. When it returned to Maine, it mustered only 190 officers and men. So they had about 260 some when they were finally mustered out, Out of those 260, not all of them went back to Maine right away. So you had 190 who actually returned to Maine, but the others actually, can you believe it, signed on to other regiments. And a group of them went over to the 8th Maine Regiment, which had been recruited about the same time from the Portland area. And interestingly enough, the 5th Maine building, 2 buildings away, is the 8th Maine building. So the 8th Maine also built a memorial hall on Peaks, or a reunion hall on Peaks Island. The 2 buildings remain. There were 5 of them in Casco Bay in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. The only 2 remaining are on Peaks Island. And I believe they are the only 2 in the state of Maine still left, still standing or not in private hands. So a building may be converted into a house later on. In the whole state of Maine, they're both on Peaks Island. The 5th Maine Regiment and the 8th Maine Regiment have similar types of reunion halls, summer cottages style, big porch all the way around. They're both still there, which is interesting. And I went on a Google search and I said, well, how many other of these Civil War reunion halls are there in the country? I could find only 1. Now, I don't know if that was what would be considered a thoroughly academic query, so I'm not sure that that is the answer, but I found 1 in Ohio. So I don't think these reunion halls from Civil War era regiments are very common. I think that's pretty rare. And both of these buildings, the 5th and the 8th, are on the National Register of Historic Places. And I said, so 190 are going back to Maine, a bunch of others have gone on, and quite a few went to the 8th Maine, by the way. And the 8th Maine was in the Shenandoah Valley. So the 8th Maine had a different area. So they ended up in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. Joyous was the day when the regiment finally received its orders to return to Maine with as proud a record as any could command in the service. Before the nation's capital, the veterans passed, and with honorable pride they could say, to all for which a noble structure stands, that noble structure stands, we have been faithful. And by, peace like an angel hovered over them and blessed the nation by her presence. Friends love and cherish the memory of the lost. And when they built the building at the 5th Maine, the building on Peaks Island, they call it the Memorial Hall. So that's what they called it. They didn't call it Reunion Hall. They called it the Memorial Hall. North, south, east, and west, everywhere, I believe the sentiment among all men who ever brought in touch with the experiences of those dark days, as well as with oncoming generations, thrilled by the patriotism of those who have gone on before, will be one nation, one union. And the flag, this flag, supported by 250,000 men who perished, and by the millions more ready to place their all upon the altar of their country, yes, that flag for which Abraham Lincoln died, the star-spangled banner in triumph shall wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. And that was his presentation, which I think is pretty neat. So, yeah. So you got a shortened version of it. So anybody have any questions or anything for me? So it's a fun thing to do because first time we gave this I gave the hour-and-a-half version at the 5th Maine in August of 2017. And it was apparently the 100th anniversary of the last time it was delivered, which was, as far as we know, is 1917. So some point in World War I history of the United States, this lecture was given in some town, but we don't know exactly where. We have some indication that it was 1917, somewhere in Maine, but we revived it. As I said, my wife made it all digital, and then we gave it again 100 years later at the 5th Maine, which was really kind of neat. So I think it's something precious, and the building is truly precious.
Yeah.
So
The other building being used too.
it is. The other building, interesting enough, the descendants of the 5th Maine gave the building to a community association. The descendants of the 8th Maine Regiment still own the 8th Maine building. And it's called a lodging house and museum because you can still rent bedrooms in the building. So when my son was married on Peaks Island some years ago, we rented the 8th Maine to house the family who came from, Pittsburgh and Washington and Baltimore and other places. We put them in bedrooms at the 8th Maine, which are pretty rustic. They haven't updated a lot from the Civil War days. They've some. But if you stay at the 8th Maine, you have this bedroom, beautiful sea view, very nice place. And you have a common kitchen down in the basement, and you have bathrooms down the hall. It's not quite the Hilton experience, but it is, people really like it. But it still rents bedrooms. Yeah. So you can actually rent a bedroom at the 8th Maine. Yeah. So, there it is. I hope you enjoyed it, and to me, it's been very interesting. Thank you. My pleasure. Good. Okay. I'll tell you. Can I tell you a quick ghost story from the 5th Maine? I'm convinced the 5th Maine is haunted. So and it's a dark and stormy day. Lisa, thank you for the lead. And I'm trying to leave the building. And it's black clouds are everywhere, and there's wind blowing and a little bit of rain coming down. And I'm trying to leave, and it's really dark it's June, so you think it's going to be a bright day, but it's dark. And I turn off all the lights in the building, and so everything sort of has a gray cast to it. And we have an alarm system. So I go to the alarm system, and I punch the numbers in, and I wait to tell me it's all set and I can leave the building. Well, it goes beep, and a little message comes up that says, motion on 2nd floor. And I said, now what would that be? Well, then I hear, now this is really strange, and I really can't explain it, except my imagination may have been running away. Then I hear walking on the 2nd floor. And it's not like an animal scurrying, it's like human walking. You know, it has that weight to it. Sounds like somebody walking from one room to another on the 2nd floor. And I'm thinking, well, goodness, I thought everyone was out of the building. So I yell up the stairs, I'm closing the building now, everyone will have to leave. I don't hear any more walking, nothing, everything is quiet. So I go back to the alarm, punch in the numbers again, beep, motion, 2nd floor. I say, oh geez, I don't want to do this. I go up and I walk through all of the 2nd floor, and I go check out every room. All the lights are off by this time. It's not dark, it's not nighttime, but it's really a dark day. And I check all the rooms out, come back downstairs. Everything is quiet. Nothing is moving, and as far as I can tell, and I punch the message, the little code in again. Beep, motion, 2nd floor. At that point, I decided I didn't need an alarm after all. I could exit the building, lock the front door, and feel quite happy. And maybe some other time I would come back. I never could explain what was going on the 2nd floor that wouldn't let me set the alarm, or the fact that I really heard genuine, to me, were footsteps from going from one room to another. And I think there may be other ghost stories. That's the one I remember. So.
They do say.
Well, thank
Sure.
you so much.
My
for that.
pleasure.
Oh, it's amazing.
It's fun to be here. Yeah.
Bring your wife next time.
Okay.